Okay, we're back. Chapter 18 in Peak by Roland Smith. It's called Secrets. It's the start of Moleskin number 2. The meeting was secret, held at HQ after the other climbers had all gone to sleep. By invitation only, Josh, the film crew, Sparky, Dr. Krieger, Thaddeus Bowen, and Zopa, who had brought Sunjo with him. Sunjo looked a little better, but not much. Josh glared at him, and I thought for a moment he was going to ask him to leave, but he let it go. Where's Holly? No one seemed to know. We're not waiting, Josh said. He turned to Dr. Krieger. How's Peke's health? I think we might have gotten the infection with the antibiotics. As long as it doesn't migrate to his lungs, he should be fine. There were 3 new cases of pneumonia reported in camp today. I suspect it's secondary infection from the virus. William Blade is one of them. Everyone in his team is sick. They left this afternoon, and we quarantined everything they left at their campsite. The news about William Blade and her former entourage was going to please Holly to no end. Josh turned to Zopa. Can Peke make it to the top? I was still seriously annoyed with Josh over the letters, and this was not helping. I hate it when people talk about me as if I'm not even there. Zopa shrugged. We will have to see how he does at Camp 4. He was fine at ABC. I wasn't fine at ABC, but I appreciated him saying it. Thanks for getting him up to ABC, Josh said. I suppose you'll be heading back to Kathmandu. Zopa gave him another shrug. What about Holly, Josh asked. She's strong, Zopa said. Josh looked a little surprised. I was too. She was fine when she finally got up to ABC and on the way down, but I wouldn't have characterized her climb as strong. What was Zopa up to? It won't hurt us to get Holly to the summit, Thaddeus said. She'll talk about it and write about it for the rest of her life. That's good PR for Peak Experience. Yeah, I suppose you're right, Josh reluctantly agreed. He pulled a notebook out of his pocket and flipped through the pages. Okay, we have 10 people to get to the top, counting Peak and Holly. One of those, 6 or 7 have a decent chance if they hit the weather window right. He looked at Sparky. Do you have some dates for me yet? I'm looking at the week of May 25th through June 4th. Sparky looked over at Zopa. But astrology might give us a better idea than meteorology. Any ideas, Zopa? Josh asked. Zopa shook his head. I just look up at the sky. This got a laugh from everyone, but I don't think Zopa meant it to be funny. If your weather prediction is right, Josh said to Sparky, that doesn't give us much time. He walked to the calendar on the wall. Peke's birthday is 6 weeks from today. That gives us about 5 weeks to get him to the position for a summit attempt. And I'd like to get him up there earlier than that. I agree, Thaddeus said. If something happens and Peke can't get to the summit, we might have a chance for a second try. Thaddeus, there won't be a second chance, Josh said. Peke either makes it on the first try or he doesn't. Josh was right. Second tries were virtually unheard of on Everest. If you fail, you have to return to base camp. There's not enough oxygen at the other camps to get your strength back and recover. It takes 3 days to get back to base camp, with a night at Camp 6 and a night at ABC. 5 days at base camp, longer if you're really hammered. Then back up, which can take 8 or 9 days. Altogether, nearly 3 weeks. It would be mid-June before I could make another attempt, long after my 15th birthday. Climbers have been stopped 100 yards from the summit by weather, exhaustion, or time, and have never made another attempt as long as they lived. Here's what I'm thinking, Josh continued. There's a couple signed up to go to Camp 4, but they're strong enough to go a lot higher. In fact, they have a better chance of getting to the summit than most of the others on the team. If we put them on the 2 scratch permits, it would increase our summit percentage by at least 20%. Did you talk to them, Thaddeus asked? Yeah, but no promises. I wanted to discuss our options first. I think you should send Sunjo to the summit, Holly said, startling all of us. Uncharacteristically, she had slipped into the tent quietly. Who? Josh asked, annoyed. Zopa's grandson, Holly answered. This sure got everyone's attention. We stared at Sunjo and Zopa with our mouths hanging wide open. I think my mouth was open a little more than the others. Josh looked like he had been slapped in the face. Why hadn't Sunjo told me that Zopa was his grandfather? Sunjo sat with his chin cupped in his hands, seemingly oblivious to our shock. What's your father's name? Josh asked him. His name was Kitar Sherpa, Sunjo answered. I knew him, Josh said quietly. I didn't know he had a son. He looked over at Zopa and gave him his trademark grin. What are you up to? Zopa just answered with a shrug. None of us believed him. There was a lot more to this than Josh, Sunjo, and Zopa were letting on. Josh looked back at Sunjo. How old are you? I'm 14 years old, he answered. I think we had just gotten the main reason Zopa had agreed to leave the Adrani temple and take me to base camp. Josh was no longer grinning, nor was anyone else, especially me. I considered Sanjo a friend. He must have known about the summit attempt back in Kathmandu. He certainly knew that Zopa was his grandfather. I should have guessed something was up when Zopa outfitted him in my climbing gear. Holly clearly had been let in on the secret, which might explain why Zopa had all but carried her up to ABC. When is your birthday? Josh asked. Sanjo looked at Zopa, who gave him a nod. May 31st. 6 days before my birthday. Josh was visibly relieved, but only for a second. How do we know that? Thaddeus asked. Sanjo reached into his pocket of my parka and produced a tattered piece of paper sealed in a Ziploc plastic bag. He pulled out the paper and handed it to Thaddeus. This is in Nepalese, Thaddeus said. Josh took it from him and read it over. No, it's Tibetan, he corrected, then looked back at Sanjo. You were born in Tibet? Yes, sir, Sanjo answered. I was 5 when my father managed to get my mother and me across the border into Nepal. I am a free Tibetan. There is no such thing, Josh said. How did you get back into Tibet? You certainly didn't use this. He handed the piece of paper back. Forged documents, Zopa said. Josh swore. Well, your grandson isn't going to be a free Tibetan for long if Captain Shek finds out about that bogus papers, Josh said. They'll arrest him. You probably be hauled away too. This explained Sanjo's disappearing act whenever the soldiers were around. A summit attempt is worth the risk, Zopa commented. Josh looked at Sanjo for a moment, then back at Zopa. I owe you, Zopa, but I haven't decided if Sanjo getting a shot at the top. And besides, we don't have enough climbing Sherpas to get 3 teams to the top. And that's what we're talking about. 3 separate teams. Yogi and Yash, Zopa said. Josh laughed and shook his head. You had this all figured out before you even left Kathmandu, didn't you? Zopa didn't answer, but it was clear that he had. Maybe you and I should go someplace a little more private and talk about this, Josh suggested. That is up to you, Zopa said, but I don't mind speaking about it here. Suit yourself. Josh looked at everyone in turn, but lingered when he got to Holly. This is totally off the record. Nothing we say here is to leave this tent, and I mean ever. If the Chinese get wind of this, they could shut down our expedition, but worse, they might grab Sanjo and put him back into prison. I thought of the shackled road gang we had passed after we crossed the Friendship Bridge, and I gave an involuntary shudder. I was mad at Sanjo, but I didn't wish that on anyone. Being arrested in the U.S. was nothing like being arrested in Tibet. I looked at him. He seemed worried, almost as if it had just dawned on him what would happen if Captain Shek caught him with his false papers. Everyone nodded in agreement, although I think the film crew would have loved to have their camera rolling. Not that Josh would let them use any of the footage in the final documentary. Sanjo's mother was born in a small village on this side of the mountain, Zopa explained. My son met her on an expedition. It took him years to get her and Sanjo out of Tibet and into Nepal. Sanjo is both Tibetan and Nepalese. The Chinese won't see it that way if Sanjo gets caught up here, Josh said. If we put him on the summit, they'll never give us a climbing permit for the north side again, Thaddeus shouted. That could take away half our business. The Tibet route is harder than the Nepal route. It has more prestige. But bringing Sanjo here, you've jeopardized our entire season. And for what? If Peek and Sanjo make it to the top, Sanjo still won't be the youngest to reach the summit. But he would be the youngest free Tibetan to summit, Zopa pointed out. It's a matter of national pride. We're in business, Thaddeus said, not politics. What is the difference? Zopa said. Enough, Josh said. He looked over at JR. How's the filming going? Okay, JR answered. We have some decent climbing sequences, a couple of good interviews. I cringed a little at hearing this. He couldn't be talking about any of the interviews with me. Any footage of Sanjo? A lot. He and Peek have been climbing together. What are you thinking? Yeah, Thaddeus added a little belligerently. What are you thinking? I'm not sure yet, Josh said. He looked over at me. How do you feel about sharing the glory? You've got to be kidding me, Thaddeus said. Josh ignored him. What do you think, Peek? I wasn't doing this for glory, or was I? I looked over at Sanjo and Zopa. They were both stone-faced. I was furious with both of them. Sanjo more than Zopa, because Zopa never told anybody anything. I wanted to tell Josh to send Sanjo packing, but to Nepal. But instead, without much enthusiasm, I said, it's okay with me. Can I talk to you, Josh? Thaddeus asked. Alone. Sure. And they left everyone They left everyone, sat there for a few moments without saying anything, and JR finally broke the silence. Poker? He pulled out a deck of cards out of his parka. Might as well, Sparky said. Josh and Thaddeus could be a while. I'm in, Holly said. I walked over to where Sanjo and Zopa were sitting. Thank you for supporting me, Sanjo said. You should have told me. I did, Sanjo said, glancing at Zopa guiltily, at least indirectly. What are you talking about? Our first night at ABC, he answered. I talked about how if we got up to Camp 4, we had a good chance at the summit. He was right about it being indirect. I barely remembered the one-sided conversation. That's pretty lame, I said. Zopa came to his defense. Sanjo did not know in Kathmandu, he said. He thought I was taking him here to become a Sherpa. It wasn't until we were on our way to ABC that I told him about the summit. So Josh and I weren't the only ones Zopa played cagey with. I glanced over at the poker game, which was in full swing, with the pile of money in the center of the table. They were lucky that Zopa wasn't playing. I'm going over to the mess tent for some tea, Zopa said. I waited until he was out of the tent, then I asked Sanjo why he hadn't told me that Zopa was his grandfather. Zopa thought it best if we keep that to ourselves, he answered. If Zopa asked me to keep something to myself, I probably would have too, but it still bothered me that Sanjo didn't tell me. Zopa returned with a thermos of tea and several mugs. I took my mug over and I watched them play poker. I wasn't really interested in the game, but I didn't want to hang with Zopa and Sanjo. Holly won every hand, much to everyone's annoyance. About 20 minutes later, Josh and Thaddeus came back into HQ. At first, I thought Thaddeus had gotten his way because he was all smiles. Sanjo noticed his expression too and looked disappointed. All right, Thaddeus said, smiling at Sanjo and Zopa. You've got your shot at the summit. You're all heading back to ABC the day after tomorrow, Josh added. The film crew groaned. Okay, that's chapter 18.